Some promises don't wait to be remembered. They wait to be opened. I didn't believe old houses could keep secrets until the afternoon I unlocked my grandmother's front door for the last time. The air inside carried the familiar scent of cinnamon, cedar, and the faint sweetness of apples that had long since disappeared, as if the walls themselves refused to admit she was gone. Dust floated through narrow beams of October sunlight, turning the quiet kitchen into something that felt suspended between memory and time. The realtor wanted the place emptied by Friday. 3 bedrooms. 1 bathroom. 1,200 square feet of memories nobody else would ever pay for. I stood in the middle of the room with a cardboard box tucked against my hip and whispered, "I'm trying, Grandma." My voice sounded strangely small, swallowed by the silence she had once filled with humming while baking pies and telling stories that never seemed to end. Every cabinet had already been emptied. Every drawer labeled. Every photograph wrapped carefully in newspaper. I had spent 6 exhausting hours deciding which pieces of someone's entire life deserved another chance in mine. The only thing left untouched stood at the far end of the kitchen. A narrow wooden pantry door painted cream decades ago, its surface covered with tiny scratches and faded fingerprints. It looked ordinary enough to anyone else. To me, it had always been the one place that never belonged to childhood curiosity. When I was 7, I reached for the brass handle. Grandma caught my wrist before I could turn it. She smiled, but her eyes stayed unusually serious. "Not yet, Claire," she'd said softly. "Some doors should only open when your heart is ready." I laughed back then because adults always said mysterious things they expected children to forget. But she repeated those exact words every single year afterward. Birthdays. Christmas dinners. Sunday afternoons. Always with the same calm smile. Always while glancing toward that little pantry. I never asked why. Maybe I was afraid she'd actually answer. Now there was nobody left to stop me. I crossed the kitchen slowly, my footsteps creaking across the old hardwood floor. Outside, a chilly breeze rattled the maple branches against the windows, sounding almost like gentle knocking. I wrapped my fingers around the cool brass handle. It didn't move. Locked. Just like it had always been. I almost smiled. Of course Grandma had kept the key somewhere impossible. I searched the kitchen one more time, opening cookie tins, flour jars, recipe books, and the little ceramic teapot she never used. Nothing. Then I noticed her favorite cookbook resting alone on the counter where I could have sworn it hadn't been an hour earlier. The pages fell open almost immediately, revealing a small bronze key taped inside beside a handwritten note. My pulse quickened before I even unfolded the paper. Her familiar handwriting curved gently across the yellowed page. "If you're reading this, sweetheart, it means I kept my promise. Now it's your turn to keep yours. Open the pantry. Trust the man who comes after. And whatever happens, don't let anyone else have the key." I stared at those words until they blurred together. Trust the man who comes after. What man? My grandmother had lived alone for nearly 20 years. She barely trusted salesmen, let alone mysterious strangers. I looked toward the pantry again, and for the first time in my life, I realized I wasn't opening an old wooden door. I was opening the first page of a story someone else had started long before I was born. The tiny bronze key felt unexpectedly heavy in my palm, as though years of waiting had settled into the cold metal. I slid it into the lock, hesitated for one slow breath, and turned it until an old click echoed through the kitchen. The sound seemed impossibly loud inside the empty house. The door resisted at first, then opened with a soft groan that released the faint smell of cedar, dried herbs, and aged paper instead of canned food or forgotten shelves. A single pull chain hung from the ceiling. I tugged it gently, and a warm bulb flickered to life, revealing a narrow room no larger than a walk-in closet. Wooden shelves lined both walls, but they were almost completely empty. There were no hidden fortunes, no dusty antiques, no mysterious family treasures. Only one cedar chest rested on the floor beneath the far shelf, polished carefully enough that someone had been protecting it for years. I knelt beside it, running my fingertips across the smooth wood. My grandmother had dusted this box more faithfully than the furniture in the living room. The realization sent an unexpected chill through me. She had been preparing for this day all along. The lid was not locked. Inside rested 3 objects placed with almost ceremonial precision. The first was an old black and white photograph showing a young woman who looked remarkably like my grandmother standing beside a teenage boy with dark hair and thoughtful eyes. They were smiling at the camera as if the future had not yet learned how to disappoint either of them. The second object was an elegant silver pocket watch engraved with the initials EM. Time had stopped on its face years ago, frozen at exactly 8:17. The third was a cream-colored envelope with my name written neatly across the front. My throat tightened before I even broke the seal. Claire, if you have reached this letter, then you already know I trusted you more than anyone else. There is a man who may come looking for what is inside this box. Do not fear him simply because others do. Listen before you judge. Every story has 2 versions, and his has never been told honestly. His name is Ethan Moretti. He once made me a promise that cost him more than anyone will ever understand. Now I need you to help him keep it. I read the letter twice, hoping the words would somehow explain themselves. They never did. Ethan Moretti. The name meant absolutely nothing to me, yet something about seeing it in my grandmother's handwriting made it impossible to dismiss. I turned the photograph over. On the back, written in fading blue ink, were 6 simple words. Summer. Nantucket. Never break your promise. My heartbeat quickened. Whoever Ethan Moretti was, he had been part of my grandmother's life long before I was born, and somehow she had carried that connection in complete silence for decades. I reached for my phone almost automatically, opened the search bar, and typed his name. Before I could press enter, the lights throughout the house flickered once. Then twice. Somewhere outside, tires rolled slowly across the gravel driveway and came to a quiet stop. The sound of tires on gravel should not have frightened me, but standing alone in my grandmother's kitchen with a stranger's name echoing through my thoughts, every ordinary noise suddenly carried the weight of possibility. I stayed perfectly still, listening as the engine outside settled into silence. Nobody knocked. Nobody called my name. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. My phone remained in my hand, Ethan Moretti still glowing across the search bar. I pressed enter. Within seconds the screen filled with headlines that made my stomach tighten. Real estate investor. Philanthropist. Chairman of the Moretti Foundation. Business leader. His photograph appeared again and again beside articles about hospital donations, scholarship programs, and historic building restorations. Every image showed the same man. Mid-30s. Dark hair brushed neatly back. Calm gray-blue eyes that somehow looked both watchful and distant. There was nothing in those polished interviews that explained why my grandmother had hidden his name inside a cedar chest for decades. Yet there was something about his expression that made me pause. He smiled for every camera, but none of those smiles ever reached his eyes. They looked like the eyes of someone who had spent years carrying responsibilities too heavy to set down. I opened another article. It described him as one of the most influential businessmen on the East Coast, famous for avoiding interviews and living an intensely private life. Another story mentioned his family's long history of success but carefully skipped over several years of public records, as though entire chapters had quietly disappeared. The gaps bothered me more than the information itself. My grandmother had always said that silence could reveal more than conversation if someone knew how to listen. I looked back at the cedar chest. The silver pocket watch rested exactly where I had found it, reflecting the soft light above. On impulse I picked it up. It felt warm despite the cool room. My thumb brushed against the engraved initials. There was a tiny indentation beneath the winding crown that I had not noticed before. Curious, I pressed it gently. A hidden compartment clicked open with surprising precision. Folded inside was a narrow strip of paper no wider than my finger. It contained only one sentence written in my grandmother's unmistakable handwriting. If he still carries this watch, then he never forgot. My heart skipped. Carries this watch? The watch was here. Unless. I turned it over again, studying every scratch and every polished edge. There was no dust inside the compartment. None at all. Somehow that disturbed me more than anything else. This had not been abandoned. It had been maintained. Someone had cared for it before it arrived here. A sudden knock sounded against the front door. 3 slow taps. Calm. Patient. Nothing like a salesman or delivery driver. I nearly dropped the watch. Another 3 knocks followed, exactly the same distance apart. My pulse thundered in my ears as I slipped the folded note into my sweater pocket and closed the cedar chest. Every instinct told me not to answer, but curiosity pulled harder than fear. I crossed the hallway one careful step at a time until I could see the blurred outline of a tall figure standing beyond the frosted glass. Before my hand even reached the doorknob, a deep, composed voice spoke through the door. Claire Bennett, my name is Ethan Moretti. I believe your grandmother has been expecting this conversation for 24 years. For several long seconds I could not make my hand touch the doorknob. I simply stood there staring at the frosted glass while the silhouette outside remained perfectly still. Most people shifted their weight. They checked their phones. They cleared their throats. This man did none of those things. He waited with the quiet patience of someone completely comfortable with silence. My grandmother's final letter echoed inside my mind. Listen before you judge. I drew one slow breath and unlocked the deadbolt. The door opened only a few inches at first. He stepped back immediately, giving me space before I even realized I needed it. That small gesture caught me off guard. Ethan Moretti looked almost exactly like the photographs I had seen only moments earlier, except the pictures had failed to capture the quiet exhaustion around his eyes. He wore a charcoal overcoat over a navy suit tailored with effortless precision. The autumn wind stirred a few loose strands of dark hair across his forehead, but he made no attempt to smooth them back. His expression was calm, respectful, almost solemn. 2 black sport utility vehicles sat several yards behind him near the edge of the driveway. They were polished but unmarked, blending into the gray afternoon without drawing unnecessary attention. I noticed a few people standing near the vehicles, dressed professionally, speaking quietly among themselves without once looking toward the house. They seemed determined to give us privacy. Ethan followed my gaze before looking back at me. They will stay where they are, he said gently. I came to speak with you, not to overwhelm you. His voice carried the same steady confidence I had heard through the door, never demanding, never hurried. I folded my arms across my chest without realizing it. You knew my grandmother? He lowered his eyes for a brief moment before answering. I knew Eleanor Bennett when I was 16 years old. She changed the course of my life. There was no hesitation in his reply, only quiet certainty. She never mentioned you, I admitted. A faint smile touched his face, filled with more sadness than amusement. That was part of our agreement. The answer only created more questions. How did you know I was here today? His eyes moved briefly toward the kitchen window. Because your grandmother arranged it many years ago. I almost laughed. She passed away 2 weeks ago. I know. His voice softened. She also prepared for that day long before either of us imagined it would arrive. I searched his face for any sign that this was some elaborate misunderstanding, but all I found was sincerity wrapped in remarkable self-control. You expected me to open the pantry. He nodded once. I hoped you would. Why? For the first time since I opened the door, he looked genuinely uncertain. Not afraid. Simply careful. As though every word mattered. Because she believed you would choose compassion before suspicion. I felt my defenses weaken despite myself. He was saying impossible things with such quiet conviction that they no longer sounded impossible. Then his eyes drifted past me into the hallway. They stopped for only a second before returning to mine. You found the cedar chest. It was not a question. My heartbeat quickened again. I had never mentioned it. I had barely believed it myself. how do you know that? His gaze settled gently on the pocket of my sweater where the folded note rested. Because if you had not, you would never have opened the door for a man whose name belonged to someone your grandmother trusted before she trusted anyone else. I studied Ethan for several quiet seconds, waiting for something to feel wrong. A rehearsed smile. An impatient glance. A contradiction that would let me close the door and convince myself this strange afternoon had simply gone too far. None of it came. He stood exactly where he was, hands relaxed at his sides, giving me every opportunity to end the conversation if I chose. It was a level of restraint I had not expected from a man whose name carried so much influence. You said my grandmother trusted you, I finally said. Trust is earned. Tell me how. His eyes softened, not with relief, but with memory. May I come inside? He asked. Only if you are comfortable. I hesitated before stepping aside. 5 minutes. That is more than I expected. He entered slowly, removing his coat before crossing the threshold, almost as though he considered the house sacred. He paused beside the family photographs lining the hallway table. His gaze rested on a picture of my grandmother holding me at 6 years old, both of us covered in flour after attempting to bake cookies. A faint smile appeared on his face. She always believed baking could fix almost anything. My heart skipped. I had never told anyone that had been her favorite saying. We walked into the kitchen where the pantry door still stood open. Ethan stopped the moment he saw the cedar chest resting on the floor. For the first time since arriving, the careful control in his expression cracked. It lasted only a heartbeat, but I saw it. Gratitude. Regret. Maybe both. He knelt beside the chest without touching it. She kept it exactly as I remember. His voice had become almost a whisper. She promised she would. I folded my arms again. You knew what was inside all these years? He nodded once. Every item was placed there for a reason. Then explain them. He looked toward the photograph of the teenage boy beside my grandmother. That picture was taken on Nantucket during the summer I met Eleanor. I was 16. My father sent me there because he believed distance could solve every family problem. Instead, I met someone who taught me that kindness was stronger than fear. I listened without interrupting. His words carried no trace of exaggeration. They sounded like someone carefully opening old memories one at a time. The pocket watch belonged to my grandfather, he continued. He gave it to me before he passed away. Eleanor insisted I leave it with her one day. Why would you do that? I asked. Ethan smiled faintly. Because I trusted her more than I trusted myself. My eyes drifted toward the silver watch resting inside the chest. The hidden note said, if he still carries this watch, then he never forgot. But the watch has been here. Ethan looked at the engraving for several long moments before quietly reaching into the inside pocket of his suit jacket. My breath caught. He placed an identical silver pocket watch beside the first one. Same initials. Same scratches. Same frozen hands pointing to 817. They were impossible to tell apart. There were always two, he said softly. One stayed with Eleanor. The other stayed with me. My confusion only deepened. Why would anyone make two identical watches? Ethan looked directly into my eyes, and the quiet certainty in his voice sent a chill across my skin. Because 24 years ago your grandmother believed there might come a day when only matching them together could prove that the right people had finally found each other again. I looked from one pocket watch to the other, expecting to find some tiny difference that would explain everything. A scratch. A dent. A missing number. There was nothing. They reflected the same warm kitchen light with almost perfect symmetry, as though one had spent years waiting for the other to come home. Ethan carefully placed his watch beside the one from the cedar chest without letting them touch. His movements carried the quiet precision of someone handling memories instead of metal. Your grandmother believed symbols mattered, he said. She used to tell me that people forget conversations, but they remember what their hands have held. I could almost hear her voice finishing the sentence. She had told me something remarkably similar when I was little, usually after handing me one of her handwritten recipe cards. My chest tightened. How many pieces of her life had existed just beyond my sight? "Tell me about Nantucket," I whispered. Ethan remained silent for a moment, staring at the old photograph before finally speaking. "I arrived there angry with everyone. Angry with my father. Angry with expectations. Angry with a future I believed had already been chosen for me." His eyes never left the faded image. "Your grandmother owned a small bakery near the harbor that summer. I walked in because I smelled fresh cinnamon rolls before sunrise." I smiled despite myself. "That sounds exactly like her." He returned the smile, smaller this time. "I had almost no money. I intended to buy coffee and leave. Instead, she handed me breakfast and refused to accept $1. I could picture it so clearly that it almost felt like a memory of my own. Eleanor Bennett standing behind a wooden counter with flour on her apron, insisting that hungry people should eat first and argue about payment later. "She said kindness was an investment," Ethan continued. "She believed every decent choice earned interest you might never see." The kitchen grew quiet again except for the old clock above the sink ticking steadily toward evening. "What does any of this have to do with me?" I finally asked. Ethan drew a slow breath before answering. "Because one morning, before I returned home, she made me promise something." His expression became distant, as though he were standing on that island again instead of in my grandmother's kitchen. "She told me that if life ever became complicated, if power or success or responsibility ever changed who I was, then I had to remember one ordinary family that expected nothing from me." He looked directly at me. She pointed toward a photograph of her daughter holding a baby. "That baby was you." My heart skipped. "She showed you my picture?" He nodded. "You were 3 years old. Wearing yellow rain boots 3 sizes too big." A laugh escaped before I could stop it. There really had been a photograph like that. It had sat on my grandmother's refrigerator for years until the colors faded almost completely. Nobody outside the family should have known it existed. She told me that if you ever needed help one day, I was never allowed to ask whether you deserved it. I was only allowed to remember my promise. Emotion settled quietly across his face, not dramatic or overwhelming, simply honest. Then he reached into his coat pocket once more and removed a neatly folded piece of paper that had clearly been opened many times over the years. The edges had softened with age. He held it carefully between both hands before offering it to me. "I have carried this letter for 24 years, he said. "Your grandmother asked me not to open it until the day I met you again. I think we are finally meant to read it together." My fingers brushed the worn edges of the folded letter as Ethan released it into my hands. The paper felt fragile, softened by years of careful handling, yet somehow stronger than anything else inside that quiet kitchen. Neither of us spoke immediately. The ticking clock above the sink filled the silence, each second reminding me that my grandmother had planned this moment long before either of us knew it would arrive. I unfolded the letter slowly, recognizing her graceful handwriting before I read a single word. "Dear Ethan, if this letter is finally open, then life has done exactly what I prayed it would do. You kept your promise long enough to find Claire again. That means you never allowed the world to take away the best part of who you are." I paused, swallowing the tightness in my throat before continuing aloud. "Claire, if you are reading beside him, then please listen more carefully than you have ever listened to anyone before. This man owes me nothing anymore. Everything he has done since the day we met has been because he chose kindness instead of obligation. Please never mistake quiet people for uncaring people. They often carry the heaviest promises." I lowered the page and looked toward Ethan. He had not moved. His eyes remained fixed on the faded handwriting with an expression that belonged somewhere between gratitude and grief. I continued reading. 24 summers ago, a frightened young man believed the future had already been written for him. I disagreed. I told him that no family history is stronger than a good heart. If he ever forgot those words, I made him promise to visit me again. He came back every single year. My breath caught. Every year? I whispered. Ethan nodded almost imperceptibly. Even after you moved away? He answered quietly. Especially after you moved away. I stared at him in disbelief. I had visited my grandmother every Christmas, every Thanksgiving, countless weekends throughout my childhood. I had never once seen him. As though reading my thoughts, he finally spoke. I never came when family was visiting. Eleanor insisted those days belonged entirely to you. My grandmother had protected both sides of a friendship without either of us knowing the other existed. Somehow that felt exactly like something she would do. I returned to the letter. If you are wondering why I kept this hidden, the answer is simple. Promises should never become burdens. Ethan deserved the freedom to choose his own path, and Claire deserved the freedom to grow up without feeling she owed anyone gratitude she had not earned herself. If this day has arrived naturally, then I know you both chose to be here because your own hearts led you. The final lines were shorter than the rest. Claire, trust your instincts. Ethan, trust that she inherited mine. Together, finish what I could not finish alone. I folded the letter carefully, unable to look away from the familiar handwriting that would never write another page. A quiet breeze drifted through the slightly open kitchen window, carrying the scent of fallen leaves across the room. Then one of the men near the black sport utility vehicles approached the front porch with measured steps. He stopped several feet from the doorway and waited until Ethan acknowledged him with a glance. Sir, the man said respectfully, I apologize for interrupting, but someone has been asking questions about this house since early this morning. They knew the pantry had been opened before anyone outside this property should have known. Ethan's expression remained calm, but something changed behind his eyes. He looked at me with the same quiet certainty my grandmother had described in her letter. Claire, he said gently, I believe our conversation is no longer only about the past. The words settled over the kitchen like an unexpected winter frost. I looked from the man standing respectfully on the porch to Ethan, searching his face for panic, but I found none. He thanked the man with a slight nod. Please give us a few more minutes. The man quietly stepped back without another question. The front door closed again, leaving only the ticking clock and the soft hum of the refrigerator. Who would know about the pantry? I asked. Ethan rested one hand lightly against the back of a dining chair before answering. Very few people knew it existed. Fewer still understood why it mattered. Then how could someone know I opened it? He did not answer immediately. Instead, he walked toward the kitchen window and looked across the front yard where orange leaves drifted lazily across the grass. Your grandmother believed every important promise attracted curiosity. Not because promises are valuable by themselves, but because people often assume they protect something worth taking. I glanced toward the cedar chest. There is nothing valuable in there except letters and memories. Ethan turned back toward me with a faint, understanding smile. Sometimes memories are exactly what people are searching for. I frowned. I do not understand. He crossed the room slowly until he stood beside the chest once more. Neither did I when I was 16. Eleanor spent years teaching me that truth rarely arrives all at once. It comes one piece at a time, usually after we think we have already solved the puzzle. His words sounded frustratingly calm considering someone outside might already be asking questions about the house. Are you telling me I should ignore this? No. He met my eyes. I am asking you not to let fear make your decisions. My grandmother would have said exactly the same thing. The realization made it impossible to dismiss him. I looked around the kitchen that had always felt completely ordinary. The faded curtains. The worn oak table. The chipped ceramic cookie jar that had held peanut butter cookies every Sunday afternoon. Nothing about the room suggested hidden stories stretching back more than 2 decades. Yet suddenly every object seemed connected to something larger than I had ever imagined. What happens now? I asked quietly. Ethan reached into his coat and removed a small leather notebook with softened corners. He placed it carefully on the table between us. Eleanor asked me to give you this only after we read her letter together. I opened the cover. Every page contained recipes written in my grandmother's handwriting, but tucked between measurements for blueberry pie, vegetable soup, and homemade bread were short journal entries dated across nearly 25 years. Some filled only a few lines. Others covered entire pages. They described ordinary afternoons, neighborhood children, changing seasons, and occasional visits from someone she referred to only as E. She never mentioned wealth or business. She wrote instead about conversations over fresh coffee, repairing old fences, planting tomatoes, and laughing over burned biscuits. My eyes blurred as I realized she had quietly recorded an entire friendship without ever revealing his full identity. She wanted you to know the person before the reputation, Ethan said gently. Before I could respond, my phone buzzed against the kitchen counter. An unknown number flashed across the screen. I almost ignored it until a text message appeared beneath the number. It contained only one sentence. Some doors should have stayed closed. I looked up instinctively. Ethan had already seen the expression on my face. I turned the phone toward him without saying a word. He read the message once, then looked calmly toward the front window. Claire, he said in the same steady voice he had used since arriving, I think it would be wise if you did not spend tonight in this house. I looked at the message again, hoping it would somehow become less unsettling the second time. It did not. There was no signature, no explanation, only those 7 words sitting on my screen with impossible confidence, as though whoever sent them knew exactly what had happened inside my grandmother's kitchen. My fingers tightened around the phone. Can you find out who sent it? I asked. Ethan glanced at the number for only a moment before gently shaking his head. Eventually, perhaps. Right now, knowing who sent it matters less than understanding why they wanted you to read it. His calmness should have frustrated me, yet somehow it steadied my breathing instead. He was not pretending nothing had happened. He simply refused to let uncertainty control the next decision. I slipped the phone into my pocket and looked around the house once more. Every room suddenly felt different, transformed by everything I had learned during the past hour. The faded wallpaper in the hallway. The rocking chair beside the fireplace. The kitchen window where my grandmother used to wave goodbye every Sunday afternoon. I realized this was no longer just the house where she had lived. It had quietly become the keeper of promises she had protected for nearly a quarter of a century. If I leave, I asked softly, what happens to all of this? Ethan looked toward the cedar chest before answering. Nothing leaves this house today except what Eleanor specifically intended for you to carry. He carefully closed the lid of the chest and rested his hand on the polished wood for a brief moment. Some things belong exactly where memory placed them. There was something deeply comforting about the way he spoke of my grandmother. Never as though she had belonged to his past alone, but as though her kindness still deserved respect in the present. Did you ever disappoint her? The question escaped before I could stop it. Ethan smiled quietly, almost to himself. More than once. I blinked in surprise. Really? He nodded. I canceled visits because work became complicated. I forgot birthdays. I believed success could replace time. His eyes drifted toward the old recipe notebook resting on the kitchen table. She forgave me every single time, but she always reminded me of one thing. What was that? His expression softened with unmistakable affection. She said the people who love you rarely count your achievements. They remember whether you came when you promised. The words settled deeply inside me because they sounded exactly like something my grandmother would have said. Suddenly I understood why she had trusted him. Not because he was perfect, but because he remembered the lessons she had spent years teaching him. A quiet knock interrupted the silence. The same respectful man stood just outside the kitchen window instead of the front porch this time. Ethan walked over and opened the back door a few inches. They exchanged only a handful of quiet words before Ethan returned. Everything is ready, he said. There is a guest house about 15 minutes from here where you can stay tonight. It is peaceful, private, and close enough that you may return whenever you wish." I hesitated. Accepting his offer felt like stepping into a life I had never expected to enter. Refusing it suddenly felt equally impossible. My eyes wandered one final time across the kitchen until they stopped on my grandmother's favorite coffee mug sitting beside the sink. I smiled sadly. She had always told me that courage rarely felt comfortable in the moment. Perhaps this was what she meant. I reached for my overnight bag near the hallway closet, but before I zipped it closed, something small slipped from the inside pocket onto the floor. It was an old brass key I had never seen before, attached to a faded paper tag written entirely in my grandmother's handwriting. It contained only 4 words. "For the lighthouse. With Ethan." The small brass key rested in my palm with surprising warmth, as though it had been waiting years for someone to notice it. Ethan stared at the faded paper tag without speaking. For the first time since he had arrived, genuine surprise crossed his face. "She never told me about another key," he admitted quietly. "Then she kept one final secret from both of us." I turned the key over carefully. It was older than the bronze pantry key, worn smooth along its edges from decades of careful use. The tag was tied with faded blue thread I recognized immediately. My grandmother used the same thread every Christmas to wrap homemade gifts because she believed ribbons were too expensive to throw away. The memory made me smile even as my questions multiplied. "What lighthouse?" I asked. Ethan remained thoughtful for a long moment before answering. "There is only one lighthouse within 50 miles that Eleanor ever mentioned." He looked toward the window where evening light had begun settling across the quiet neighborhood. "An old stone lighthouse overlooking Harbor Point. It has been closed to the public for almost 30 years. Did she work there?" "No." He smiled faintly. "She simply loved the view." We loaded my overnight bag into the back of one of the black sport utility vehicles just as the last traces of daylight softened into a cool autumn evening. I glanced back at the little white house before climbing inside. The porch light still glowed warmly above the front steps exactly as it had every Sunday night when I left after dinner. For a moment I almost expected my grandmother to open the screen door, wave one last time, and remind me not to forget leftovers in the refrigerator. Instead, only silence remained, peaceful rather than lonely. Ethan noticed me looking. "We will come back," he said gently. "Nothing here will be rushed." The drive felt surprisingly ordinary. We passed grocery stores preparing to close, families walking their dogs, children chasing one another across front yards, and couples carrying takeout bags toward modest homes glowing with porch lights. Nobody on the sidewalks seemed to recognize Ethan despite the articles I had read earlier that afternoon. He seemed content to watch the familiar streets without drawing attention to himself. After several quiet miles I finally asked the question that had been lingering since he arrived. "Why did you never tell my grandmother that you had become successful?" He looked out the passenger window before answering. "Because every time I visited, she asked me only 2 questions." "Which were?" A quiet smile appeared. "Did you keep your word, and are you still kind to people who cannot offer you anything in return?" I laughed softly. That sounds exactly like her. Those answers mattered more to her than any title I could have mentioned. We drove another few minutes before the road curved along the shoreline. The guest house came into view, perched on a gentle hill overlooking calm water that reflected the first stars of the evening. It was elegant without being extravagant, built from weathered gray stone and surrounded by tall maple trees whose leaves danced quietly in the cool breeze. As Ethan parked the vehicle, I noticed something standing far across the bay. A tall white lighthouse rose above the cliffs, its lantern room catching the last golden light before sunset. Even from this distance it looked timeless, watching the coastline with patient silence. I reached into my coat pocket and wrapped my fingers around the old brass key once more. Without taking my eyes off the lighthouse, I whispered, "I think my grandmother knew we would end up here." Ethan followed my gaze across the water. His expression became thoughtful, almost reverent. "No," he said softly. "I think she knew tomorrow was where the real promise would finally begin." I barely slept that night. The guest house was quieter than any place I had ever stayed, the only sounds coming from gentle waves brushing against the rocky shoreline below and the occasional rustle of maple leaves outside my bedroom window. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw my grandmother's handwriting, the two identical pocket watches, and the old brass key resting on the nightstand beside the bed. Just before sunrise I gave up pretending to sleep and walked onto the back porch with a mug of coffee. The air carried the crisp bite of late October, cool enough to make me wrap both hands around the warm ceramic cup. Across the bay, the lighthouse stood against a pale blue sky, its white stone glowing as the first rays of sunlight reached the cliffs. Ethan was already outside. He stood near the wooden railing overlooking the water, dressed in a simple dark sweater instead of the tailored suit he had worn the day before. Without the formal clothes, he looked less like the powerful businessman from newspaper articles and more like the quiet young man my grandmother had described in her letters. He turned as he heard the porch door open. "Good morning, Claire." I smiled faintly. "Do you ever sleep?" A hint of amusement reached his eyes. Eleanor used to ask me the same question. I leaned against the railing beside him. For a few moments neither of us spoke. The silence felt comfortable now instead of uncertain. Finally I reached into my pocket and held up the brass key. "Tell me everything you know about the lighthouse." Ethan watched the key carefully before answering. "Only fragments." Eleanor never explained why it mattered. She simply asked me to promise that if you ever found this key, I would take you there myself. "You never asked why?" He shook his head. She believed trust meant accepting that some answers should arrive in their own time. I laughed softly. She really did have a lesson for everything. She did. His smile faded into thoughtful reflection. Years ago I asked her why she never locked the front door during the day. She told me that kindness begins by believing most people arrive with good intentions. I looked toward the quiet shoreline. She made the world sound simpler than it really is. "No," Ethan replied gently. "She simply chose not to let difficult people change the kind of person she wanted to become." Those words settled deeply inside me. For the first time since her passing, I felt grief making room for gratitude. She had not only left behind recipes and photographs. She had quietly shaped another person's entire life, and now that influence was reaching me in ways I had never expected. A vehicle approached along the winding driveway, moving slowly before stopping near the front entrance. One of Ethan's associates stepped out carrying a weathered leather folder. He greeted us politely before handing it to Ethan. "This was delivered to the house early this morning," he explained. "No return address." Ethan opened the folder carefully. Inside rested a single map of Harbor Point with one location circled in blue ink. Beneath it was another handwritten note. This handwriting was unfamiliar, sharper, and more hurried than my grandmother's careful script. It read, "She always believed the lighthouse protected the truth. Come before sunset if you wish to learn what she never told either of you." Ethan and I exchanged a long, silent look. Neither of us recognized the handwriting, but we both understood one thing at the exact same moment. Someone else had been waiting almost as patiently as my grandmother had. The road to Harbor Point followed the coastline like a ribbon of faded gray, winding between towering pines and weathered stone walls that had stood longer than anyone could remember. Ethan drove in silence, his hand steady on the steering wheel while the folded map rested between us on the center console. Every few miles I glanced at the old brass key lying beside it, wondering how one small object had quietly connected two lives across nearly 25 years. By early afternoon the lighthouse came fully into view. Up close it looked even older than I had imagined, its white paint softened by decades of sea air, its stone foundation firmly anchored against the cliffs overlooking the Atlantic. The parking area was empty except for one aging pickup truck parked beneath a windswept cedar tree. There were no tourists, no maintenance crews, only the distant cries of seagulls circling above the water. We stepped out into the cool ocean breeze, and I instinctively slipped the brass key into my coat pocket. Ethan looked toward the lighthouse entrance. "Whatever we find," he said quietly, "remember that Eleanor never left confusion without also leaving hope." I nodded, grateful that he always seemed to know exactly what I needed to hear. The heavy wooden door stood before us, secured by an iron lock darkened with age. My hands trembled slightly as I removed the brass key. It slid into the lock as though it had never belonged anywhere else. One gentle turn was all it took. The mechanism released with a deep metallic click that echoed inside the empty tower. I pushed the door open slowly. The air smelled of salt, aged timber, and old books. Sunlight streamed through narrow windows, tracing bright circles across the worn stone floor. Instead of an abandoned interior, we found a surprisingly well-kept room. Someone had swept recently. A small wooden table stood near the center with a glass lantern, several neatly stacked journals, and a sealed envelope resting on top. Across from it hung a framed photograph of my grandmother standing beside the lighthouse decades earlier, smiling into the wind while holding the same blue ribbon I had found tied around the brass key. I walked toward the picture almost without thinking. Beneath the frame a small brass plaque had been mounted into the wood. It read, "Some places exist so that promises always know where to return." My throat tightened. Ethan remained unusually quiet behind me. I turned and saw him studying the journals with unmistakable recognition. "She told me these existed once," he whispered. "I thought they had been lost." He carefully opened the top journal. Every page contained my grandmother's handwriting, documenting years of visits to the lighthouse. She wrote about changing tides, sunrise over the bay, conversations with Ethan, and reflections on forgiveness, courage, and ordinary kindness. Near the middle of the journal, a pressed maple leaf marked one particular page. Ethan gently lifted it aside. There, carefully folded into the binding, rested a legal document bearing both his name and mine. I stared at it in confusion. "What is it?" He read the first page slowly before looking at me with astonishment that matched my own. "It is a trust," he said softly. "Not for money." He paused, almost unable to believe the words himself. "Eleanor created a community foundation years ago. She named both of us as its future caretakers." I looked back toward the photograph of my grandmother smiling beside the lighthouse. Suddenly every recipe, every letter, every promise pointed toward the same simple truth. She had never been preparing us to inherit something valuable. She had been preparing us to continue something meaningful. As I reached for the final sealed envelope resting alone on the table, I noticed two signatures already written across the back. One belonged to my grandmother. The other belonged to Ethan. The space beneath them had been left completely blank, waiting for only one name. My hands lingered over the final envelope before I finally broke the seal. The paper inside was newer than the other letters, but the handwriting was unmistakably my grandmother's, graceful and steady as though she had known every word long before she ever wrote it. I read aloud, my voice barely louder than the waves crashing against the cliffs outside. "Dear Claire and Ethan, if you are standing together when this letter is opened, then my greatest hope has already come true. Not because you solved every mystery I left behind, but because you chose trust before certainty. That choice will carry you farther than any map ever could." I paused, feeling the weight of every sentence settle gently into the quiet room. I continued reading. This lighthouse was never meant to hide treasure. It was built to remind sailors that even the darkest coastline could offer direction. I wanted my life to do the same. Every recipe I shared, every conversation over coffee, every promise I protected was simply another light for someone who might one day lose their way. If you have reached this place together, then I ask only one final thing. Keep the light on. I lowered the letter, blinking back the tears that had gathered without my noticing. Ethan stood beside the window overlooking the Atlantic, his shoulders rising with one slow breath before he turned toward me. "She never stopped teaching," he said quietly. I smiled through the emotion in my voice. "Even now." We carried the trust documents and journals to the small wooden desk beneath the lighthouse windows. Together we read every page. The foundation my grandmother created had only one purpose: It funded neighborhood bakeries, family shelters, scholarships for local teachers, and community kitchens where nobody would ever be asked whether they could afford a meal before receiving one. Every project reflected something she had quietly believed all her life. Kindness should never depend on recognition. At the bottom of the final page waited the blank signature line. I looked at Ethan. She already knew you would say yes. A faint smile appeared across his face. She probably knew you would hesitate. I laughed softly because she would have been right about both of us. I picked up the fountain pen resting beside the document. My name flowed across the paper beneath theirs, completing the final line she had left unfinished. Nothing dramatic happened. No hidden compartment opened. No forgotten secret revealed itself. Instead, sunlight broke through the afternoon clouds and poured into the lighthouse, filling the room with warm golden light that reflected across the polished wood and weathered stone. It felt less like an ending than a quiet beginning. Before we left, Ethan climbed the narrow spiral staircase to the lantern room. I followed a few steps behind. The view stretched endlessly across the Atlantic, waves sparkling beneath the late afternoon sun while the little town rested peacefully along the shoreline below. Ethan rested one hand lightly against the old brass railing. 24 years ago, he said, Eleanor asked me what success looked like. I looked toward the horizon. What did you tell her? He smiled gently. I gave her a list of accomplishments. And what did she say? He looked out at the water before answering. She told me success was simpler than that. She said if someone still trusted you after 24 years, then you had already become wealthy in the only way that truly lasted. As we walked back toward the waiting car, I slipped the brass key into my coat pocket one last time, not because I still needed it, but because some promises deserve to be carried long after every door has already been opened.